Hi, it's Sebastian Stodolak through Bastiat's Eye. We live in crazy times, especially considering the way central banks responded to pandemic. It needs explanation. And if we search for the explanation of monetary and central banks economics, there is no better address than George Selgin. His research covers a broad range of topics within the field of monetary economics, including monetary history, macroeconomic theory, and the history of monetary thought. He is a senior fellow and a director of the Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives at Cato Institute and professor emeritus of economics at the University of Georgia. And he is here with us today. How are you, Professor?
I'm fine. I'm very happy to be here. I wish I were in Warsaw again, but this will have to do for now.
Yeah, I'm sure you're going to come here again someday in maybe not so distant future. But right now, we're talking about pandemic, and it's kind of a big deal for banking, central banking too. Like I said, the central banking thing, people got confused. Before pandemic, we were told central banks should be politically independent, and the central banks should be cautious when dealing with monetary supply. And here we are in the pandemic. Now we are told completely different things. Is it kind of a paradigm shift in monetary economics going on?
I think we're seeing what could be the beginning of a paradigm shift, and I hope we won't. Some countries have gone further down that in that direction than we have here in the United States. And of course, I'm mostly familiar with what's happened here in the United States. And in our case, the shift has mainly been manifested in the various emergency programs that the Federal Reserve, our central bank, launched last year. It has not so much been a question yet of monetization of deficits, although it's difficult to tell because the Fed has, of course, bought tremendous amounts of federal government debt. However, so far, it can justify those purchases as being warranted by its inflation control objectives. Whether that continues to be the case in the more distant future is unclear. But the emergency programs clearly mix the Fed up in fiscal matters in a way that is new and I think disturbing.
So will it stay with us, this new approach? And if so, what part of the new approach will stay with us? What part will go away?
Well, there are several aspects to what's new. Some of it is new, not just since last year, but since the 2008 crisis, the crisis that led to the Great Recession. So let's separate the two things that have happened, that have changed the Fed's conduct. In the first crisis, the Fed switched in October 2008 to this system of abundant reserves. Two things were involved in that change. One was the beginning of interest payments on reserves. And the other complementary change was the creation of vast amounts of reserves through quantitative easing for the first time. And so now we have a system that is since 2008 where banks are sitting on massive amounts of reserves, and interest rates are regulated by the amount of interest or the rate of interest the Fed pays on reserves, not by the quantity of reserves. Small changes in the quantity of reserves no longer affect the stance of monetary policy like they used to. Instead, that stance depends on the interest the Fed is paying on reserves. Right now, of course, it's paying hardly anything. We're near the zero lower bound, as they say. So that's one change. And that change, of course, remains in place. And last year, during the crisis, and still today, it provoked or allowed the Fed to engage in new rounds of quantitative easing, which have seen its balance sheet, that is, its total assets and liabilities, grow. They have doubled even since 2000, since the last rounds of quantitative easing. The Fed is now twice as big as it was after those rounds of quantitative easing. And those Great Recession rounds of quantitative easing made it 4 times as big as it was before 2008. So altogether, it's 8 or 9 times bigger. It'll soon be 9 times bigger than it was before, and it'll keep growing. So that's huge. The other thing that has changed is, particularly last year, is, as I said, the emergency lending, the scope of the Fed's emergency lending. Like most central banks, the Fed traditionally was just a lender of last resort for other banks. So its emergency lending was limited to other banks it dealt with directly. It didn't lend to anyone else. And its emergency lending to banks was seen as part of its overall responsibility for regulating the money supply, mainly by preventing bank failures from causing disruptive changes in the total quantity of money. Last year, we saw the Fed engage in all kinds of non-bank lending, from buying corporate bonds on the open market and even directly from some corporate bond issuers, to making loans through commercial banks, but acquiring loans from commercial banks that were loans to ordinary businesses, the so-called Main Street programs, to lending to municipalities and several other emergency programs. And these clearly marked a step towards Fed involvement in what's broadly fiscal policy, because it's not just maintaining the total amounts of money and credit in the economy, its traditional role. It is also allocating credit to specific sectors and groups in the economy other than banks. And this is, of course, interfering in more specific ways with market functioning. But it's also, it's also, just to complete that thought, it also means the Fed is involved in allocating funds that might be considered government funds that should be allocated through by fiscal authorities who are answerable to Congress and to our other representatives.
Yeah, well, actually, I was precisely about to ask about that, because I was about to ask how the reaction of central banks, specifically now Fed, but also ECB, corresponds to the nature of this crisis. Because, well, the world before the pandemic hit in 2019, where the world's economy were performing normally. So people had money, the producers were producing, and out of the sudden we had this pandemic, we had those lockdowns and so on. So actually there were people willing to buy, there were people willing to produce, but the only barrier between them was the virus and the lockdowns, those two things. Why did we react with creating additional money supply? Where is this link to connect those things?
Well, there was a link, and this link does suggest that some Fed response, Federal Reserve response, and this goes for the ECB as well, was warranted. In monetary economists speak of the supply of money on one hand and its velocity on the other, where basically velocity is how quickly people are spending whatever quantity of money is in the economy. And what happened during COVID, and now it's ceasing to be the case, but what happened with the COVID outbreak is precisely because of lockdowns or people's unwillingness to go to restaurants or travel, etc., especially the decline in that kind of activity. you had in effect a big decline, a very severe decline in the velocity of money. So the money that was out there was not being spent much. And that meant that the earnings of businesses would collapse even more than might otherwise have been the case because of the disease itself. And so it was right and proper that the Fed should respond and that fiscal authorities should respond somehow to try to maintain some reasonable amount of spending in the economy, because otherwise, you know, if spending collapses, you're going to get a recession, a serious recession, because firms' revenues are going to, not just in particular cases, but generally fall short of their costs and expenditures, their historic costs. So I have a jet plane flying over.
Are you living close to the airport, right?
No, not really. I usually don't hear anything quite that loud. So let's hope it knows what it's doing, this plane. Anyway, so you have you want to make sure that the monetary and fiscal authorities don't let the economy suffer more than it needs to because of the disease. It's going to suffer one way or the other, but one can argue that there's a case for limiting that suffering. And the case here is a simple monetary policy case for making sure the quantity of money grows to offset the velocity. And that's exactly that happened last year.
So some reaction was needed. But
yes, I absolutely.
But was it the proper reaction?
Well, let's say that the overall growth of the money stock and and overall increments to spending were in themselves quite appropriate. What was not, in my opinion, appropriate was the division of labor between the fiscal and the monetary authorities. Because as I was saying before, it's one thing for the monetary authorities to see to it that the total money supply and the supply of credit that goes along with it are adequate to maintain a certain level of total spending. But when it comes to directing credit to particular sectors of the economy or particular groups, particular markets, that's the sort of thing that the decisions about how to do that should be made by by the fiscal authorities, because then they're subject to the decisions of Congress and other representatives. And that's how these allocative decisions should be made. Who to bail out, who to help, who to allow to fail. Those are questions that really, I think, should be addressed by fiscal authorities, not by the Federal Reserve through creating special programs that direct credit here or there. Just to give you an example of why this is the Fed's involvement in those decisions is problematic. It's problematic in several ways, but take the case of the support for the corporate bond market, which two of the Fed's programs were designed for. This really upset a lot of people. Now, you could say that it was helpful macroeconomically and so on, but the fact remains that when many people with very limited means were suffering during the crises, it was at best very bad optics for the Fed to be apparently intervening to help Wall Street, right? Firms that one might expect should be able to fend for themselves, provided the overall stance of monetary policy is correct, right? They should be able to get their credit where it's needed. So the politics of these interventions were very bad. And all the more so when you realize that the Fed's attempts during the same time to increase lending to relatively smaller borrowers, those were not successful at all. The Main Street programs I mentioned ended up lending much less than they were expected to or capable of lending. So people could look at this and say, here's the Fed setting up these programs, some of which are helping Wall Street a lot, and others are supposed to help the little guy, and they're not working very well at all. And it looks like the Fed is playing favorites, and in a way it is. So I think that this is bad for the Fed, and the Fed ends up facing criticism and pressures that ultimately undermine its capacity, I think, to do its proper job, which is just seeing to the total amounts of these monetary assets in the economy.
I remember when I talked with you some time ago, you were saying that, well, actually, this is kind of an impossible task on the side of central bankers to try to, match this perfect interest rate with this real market ones. I mean, they're always either too fast or too slow. The interest rates are too high or too low. You cannot find this perfect point. So now you're saying that. Well, so do you still hold this view?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And there's no inconsistency, if I may say, because what I'm saying now is that, yes, in the best of times, the Fed and other central banks have faced a great challenge in trying to manage total money supply and total credit supplies correctly. Whether by correctly you mean to achieve their own self-assigned goals like 2% inflation, or correctly for avoiding as much as possible any disturbances to the real economy. That's always difficult, just as we discussed in the past. My point is that by taking on these other projects, emergency lending and credit allocation activities, central banks are taking on even more difficult and politically controversial tasks that complicate their already very difficult task of just managing total credit supplies adequately. And we are, and this is the real danger of what happened last year. The public is expecting more and more from its central banks, to the point of expecting its central banks to do things that previously either wouldn't be done by anyone or would be the responsibility of government fiscal authorities.
There is this modern monetary theory that I think that you are implicitly referring to right now, because this is this theory that justifies actually almost unlimited use of monetary and fiscal authorities to create new spending.
Yes and no. I want to be fair to the modern monetary theorists, because there are two issues here. One is just how accommodative expansionary policies should be. How generous should these policies be? The other is, who's responsible for these expansionary policies or stimulus policies? And to be fair to the modern monetary theorists, they are not the ones who are counting on the Fed to do more and more, to be more and more responsible for credit allocation in the economy. They want an accommodative Fed, don't get me wrong. They think that we can have a lot more deficit spending than others have said could be sustained. And there's some value to those to that claim, but they would have the fiscal authorities do more. That is, they would not saddle central banks with the responsibilities that central banks have taken on. They would have the fiscal authorities do more. They would have more government spending. They would have central banks passively accommodate the spending, but they wouldn't have central banks. They haven't been arguing that central banks should decide who gets the money. They don't actually believe that. And so on that particular issue, I am in accord with the monetary theorists, or they're in agreement with me, that if it's an allocative decision, if it's about who gets the money, that should be left to the fiscal authorities. The Fed should stick to just influencing the overall credit conditions of the economy.
But there should be somebody who is able to say stop it when, for example,
yes,
the
should.
inflation pressure arises.
Yeah, this is where I disagree. This is one of the points where I disagree with the modern monetary theorists, because they also think, because they think that central banks should passively accommodate government spending, they also would rely on fiscal authorities to decide when to stop, right? Whereas I think it's a good thing that we have central bankers who independently can put on the brakes when and independently determine when it's time to stop. That doesn't mean that I think central bankers get this right. We've already said that they often don't. And modern monetary theorists are not wrong in pointing out what most economists now accept, that in the recent past, they've tended to put the brakes on too early. That's all right. I'm all right with that. But I still think that if we don't rely on central banks to put on the brakes when it really needs to be done, it's highly doubtful that fiscal authorities, at least under current arrangements, would put on the brakes on time, because most government officials tend to be rewarded by the spending they do, and not by their efforts to limit spending for inflation control. We'd have to change incentives a lot before we could rely on fiscal authorities as inflation watchdogs.
You say that you agree with the observation of the MMT supporters when they say that in the past, central banks reacted too early, put the brakes too early, right?
Well, the Fed has in recent past. I agree that they tightened prematurely after 2015. I don't think this mistake was had quite the severe consequences that some would attribute to it. But I think it's fair to say that the Fed's stance has been more frequently too tight than too loose since 2008.
So I was trying to ask a question whether there is such a phenomenon existing in a field of monetary policy as institutional learning, when central banks face various crises during the history and they learn how to handle them and they become better and better, and now they know what to do. So what they are doing right now is the outcome of the past lessons they took very seriously.
That's right. And I would respond by saying this, that indeed there is such a thing as institutional learning, and central banks do engage in it. However, it's also true that the future differs from the past, and there are new crises all the time. So central bankers are always trying to learn from past crises, but they don't seem to ever quite learn what they need to learn for the next crisis. So the total ignorance gap, to call it that, by analogy with the output gap, there's a central bank ignorance gap that in the long run stays about as big as ever. They learn from the past, but the future always brings new challenges, so they're always a little bit behind. Sometimes they're a lot behind. So we can't expect them to ever catch up and get everything right. It's just not going to happen. We can hope, though, that their mistakes will become less serious. I do think that some of the mistakes central banks make are a result of them clinging to wrong ideas and doing so over extended periods of time. And to the extent that they can overcome that, we may see the gap, the ignorance gap, close a little bit more.
Well,
that's my optimistic view.
Well, it seems central banks have a lot of things to do in the future, because both American government and European governments, European Union decided to spend a lot in the future, in the coming 5 to 7 years. Right, so Biden's plan around 2 billion through 2 trillions, and also European Union's plan is worth similar amount of money. So that would suggest that central banks will engage in delivering liquidity to the system, and they will not raise interest rates in the near future. And they will try to, keep the interest rates of the bonds low, so governments will have no problems with financing all those new plans and obligations. So, what does it mean for the value of money? So, what does it mean for inflation?
Well, if all the things you say will happen, inflation will get worse, of course, but it isn't clear that that's what we're in for. I think, first of all, that you're quite right, that the pressure on central bankers is going to be very great as debt accumulates, both here in the United States and in Europe. There will be a tremendous pressure on central bankers to not raise rates, because it will raise the burden of the debt and compound the difficulty, and ultimately compel them to go even further into debt. And you can get into a situation, and this is what we have to fear, where whether the authorities raise interest rates, whether the monetary authorities raise interest rates or not, we're going to have very serious debt problems. We're going to have very serious problems, either because of debt or because of unwanted inflation. Now, things are okay. But if you project for, and that's why inflation expectations are low according to market signals in the United States. I don't know where they stand in Europe right now, but they're not terribly high. But when we look at projections for the growth of debt going forward to, say, 2050, when in the United States it'll be something like 250% of GDP, that is the amount of debt. Then the problems can become very serious, and it's not clear that inflation won't start to become an issue again, or that the central bankers will have the discipline to rein it in. So I think we should be concerned, but not alarmist, because, as I said, right now, it doesn't seem that inflation is a problem, or expected to be a problem for some time. That can change, but I do feel that we all need to be on high alert and hope that central bankers will not blink when it comes to needing to raise interest rates, and that the fiscal authorities will therefore feel compelled to take steps to make sure that they can meet their interest burden without relying on inflation to reduce the value of outstanding debt.
Before I ask one final question, I need to change place, because suddenly internet got much worse. So for the last question, I'd like to ask you about your view on the perfect monetary arrangement. I mean, perfect, not in the way that it will be working idly, but the best possible ones. So please describe because it's the world without central banks. You don't like central banks too much, so probably it's the world without central banks. How such a world would work, and how such a monetary arrangement would respond to a crisis like pandemic.
Wow, that's a big final question, isn't it?
That is true.
Yeah. When you say not the best, but whatever we can achieve, it's still very tricky, because who knows what's possible, right? What's possible politically. But since you encourage me to speculate about a system where there really is no central bank, that means we can't be relying on ordinary fiat currency as our basic currency. If that's the assumption, then I think the best alternative, in principle, this is somewhat hypothetical, but would be something like a form of cryptocurrency as our base currency that resembles Bitcoin in being automatically regulated, having a supply that's automatically regulated. However, I wouldn't have it regulated in the same manner as Bitcoin. I would have it regulated so that it automatically responds to velocity, so that shocks like the shock we had to velocity last year automatically lead to a response that keeps spending stable. Milton Friedman, by the way, I'm not being terribly original here. Even long before Bitcoin, Milton Friedman talked about having a money supply run by or controlled by a computer, so you didn't need central bankers to manage it. Now, he had a simple case where he thought if we just have the amount of official money increase 4% or 5% a year, that would be good. That's easy to program. I'm talking about a program. We have better capacity for this. But the other thing that I would have is, again, with an analogy to Bitcoin, I would have this program be one that once you get it going, you throw away the key and nothing can change it. So the only thing that can happen with the official money supply is it changes to keep velocity, to keep total spending constant. Then I would have a relatively flexible banking system without too many regulations that allowed banks and other private financial institutions to create substitutes, which can also contribute to stability of spending. But you get the idea. I want a monetary system that keeps spending stable, which is the same thing as one that allows the money supply, the supply of basic official money and substitutes to grow only when people are accumulating and holding on to more, so that spending flows are maintained. That's my ideal monetary system. Technically, I think it's achievable. Politically, that's a different story, of course. I don't favor going back to a gold standard for all kinds of reasons. So I did want to say something about that still popular option for many. The problem with the gold standard is it had desirable automatic qualities, actually, very good ones, really, but only for so long as it was an international standard did those qualities prevail. So in order to replicate that, we'd have to have many countries agree to go back. And the other problem with the gold standard is it depended on people trusting central banks to maintain the standard. And we now know that that trust has evaporated over the course of the 20th century because so many central banks broke their promises. I don't think that those promises could easily be made trustworthy. Such promises could be made trustworthy again. We need a system where it's trustworthy, and it would have to therefore be something different than the gold standard, because history has now undermined the trustworthiness of any government-based gold standard. So we have to have something, and that's what I like about Bitcoin. Everything you can criticize about Bitcoin, there are all kinds of things. But one thing you can't say about it is that we can't be trusted to come up to a limit of 21 million coins and stop. That seems to be a reliable commitment. Now, if we can just get a similarly reliable commitment that's a little smarter than that, macroeconomically speaking, that would be a good basic money to start with.